Hi, and welcome back. A while ago I made a video that introduced the Leibniz subsystem from chaos devices, as well as the concept of 8-bit signal conversion. If you haven't watched that video yet, I highly recommend you watch it first, because today we're going to dive deeper into the system with Erfurt and Jena. Erfurt is a compact module that can do interesting clock dividing duties on its own. But within a larger Leibniz system, it can manipulate signals passing through, like CV, as well as audio. Jena is a module that works best with others in the system. It can produce creative rhythms, create complex audio rate wavetables, completely destroy audio, and function as a complex wave shaper for things like audio and control voltages. If you like to support my videos, or you want to get access to PDF sheets with hundreds of patch ideas I used in my videos, have a look at my Patreon. You can also support my channel through affiliate links in the video description. But now, let's dive right in. Erfurt is a creative addition to the Leibniz system, but also a powerful clock tool on its own. In my previous video, I explained 8-bit in depth. I showed all 256 values that can be created with an 8-bit pattern, and that every pattern linked to each value is unique. The first one looks like this, the second like this, the third like this, and so on. It's possible to go through all values like this, with each new value selecting a new pattern. This is exactly what Erfurt is designed to do. There are 8 gate outputs here. These match the current selected 8-bit pattern. It also has LEDs, so you can easily see the active pattern, and thus which gate outputs are high. With the 2 buttons here, with the plus and minus sign, you can increase or decrease the selected value with a certain amount. Without any Leibniz modules connected, the amount is default to 1. This sounds complex, but it's exactly as I just animated. Starting from value 0, pressing the plus 1 time will go into the 8-bit pattern representing value 1. Another press goes to the pattern representing value 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and so on. With the minus button, you can count back from where you are to 7, 6, 5, 4, and so on. Press both to reset the value to 0. This on its own is quite fun. You can look at this as a very creative and complex manual gate. I'll explain this patch at the end of this chapter. But instead of pressing the buttons manually, the module offers a few options. First off, there are gate inputs to increase or decrease the value with a clock, and there's a gate input to reset to 0. When you feed the module a steady input here, it just keeps counting up along with the clock. Last time I also showed that if you visualize all 256 patterns as connected squares, you get these mathematical divisions. The lowest bit turns off or on every time it receives a clock, effectively outputting a gate pattern that's the clock divided by 2. The second bit goes at half the speed of that, so the clock divided by 4. The third again half of that, so divided by 8, and so on. You can see this easily on the LEDs of the module. With a steady clock input, the module outputs work like a clock divider with a divide by 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, and 256. When you use a clock to increase the value, you get this pattern. This might be inverse of what you expect from a clock divider though. If you use a selection of gates for a head, kick, and snare, for example, they don't create a standard 4 to the floor pattern. But this is easily solved if you feed a clock to decrease the value input. This results into these 8 gate outputs. This counts down through all the values and thus goes through the 8-bit patterns in reversed order. This is what you might want from a clock divider and does give classic 4-to-the-floor trigger patterns. Both options are very usable. Finally, if you don't use any of the clock inputs, you can use this switch to turn the Leibniz clock on or off, and the right switch to select one of 3 frequency scaling options. I'll dive deeper with Erfurt in combination with other Leibniz modules in the next chapter, but here are a few solo patches. In this setup, Erfurt is used as a complex manual gate or latch generator. The first 3 outputs are gating envelopes, all opening a filter in simple voices. To add some motion to the voices, each oscillator has an LFO modulating things like wave shape or pulse width modulation. Manually cycling through Erfurt will activate different selections of voices. But of course, you could add a steady or random clock to automate this process. Here, Erfurt is patched up as an independent clock divider. A steady clock is sent to decrease the value, and 4 gates are used to trigger percussive samples. Even just within Erfurt, there are options to mess with the patterns. For example, you can send one gate to something like a trigger sequencer and program a pattern to the clock increase. As the increase has priority over the decrease, this shuffles up the pattern. In the next demo, I used the last 3 gates in the same way as the first patch, to gate envelopes opening filters in small voices. Chaining modules opens up a lot of possibilities within the Leibniz system. In this chapter, I'll explain more about this using Erfurt. First off, all modules in the Leibniz series have 10-pin connectors on the back to communicate digital data. Each module has an in and output. This is Drezno and this is Erfurt. Don't confuse these with the power connectors, although similarly, they do have to be connected properly, with attention for the right placing of the red stripe. This is marked with an arrow like this or dot like this. So not the dot with in and out labels. That had me confused for a sec, so please take your time when rearranging or connecting modules. Each of the modules get extra superpowers when you chain them. In this simple patch, I chained the output of Lipsk to the input of Erfurt. That's all. As I explained in the last chapter, clock increase and decrease functions of Erfurt are default to 1 when there's no input. But in this setup, you can use Lipsk to send alternative values to Erfurt via the cable on the back. When you program a value of 0 on Lipsk, nothing happens when you increase or decrease the clock. When you set Lipsk to a value of 1, it acts the same as before, going from 0 to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and so on. Reset, and with Lipsk set to 2, Erfurt will do 2, 4, 6, 8, and so on. Set Lipsk to 3, Erfurt will go 3, 6, 9, 12, and so on. Setting Lipsk to higher values will create larger and to my brain less predictable results. To show a useful patch with this setup, you can feed a steady clock to Erfurt and use a few outputs to trigger percussive sounds. Now you can use Lipsk to select the behavior. With Lipsk set to 1, you create classic clock divisions. But with other values, you create more dynamic patterns. You can expand on this by sending an external reset to Erfurt, gates to Lipsk to change sequences, and of course you can even self-patch the system and feed gates from Erfurt back to Lipsk. This setup offers a lot of pattern generation and can be an interesting gateway into the subsystem. In this setup, Lipsk is sent to Erfurt and Erfurt on to the digital to analog input on Drezno. Again, a clock input is sent to Erfurt. In this setup, the patterns created by Lipsk and Erfurt are translated into an analog voltage by Drezno. This can be used to modulate a filter, for example. The signal is also sent to an oscilloscope to make clear what's going on. With Lipsk set to 1 and an audio rate clock, Erfurt counts up very fast, creating a rising saw wave. Setting higher values with Lipsk will increase the speed of the wave. With a slower clock to the input of Erfurt, this creates evolving patterns. Adding external signals to Lipsk or patching from Erfurt will create more complex patterns. Of course, you can still use the outputs of Erfurt directly to trigger percussion or other things like envelopes for modulation in your patch. In this setup, the analog to digital side of Drezno is also connected to the input of Lipsk. With Lipsk turned off and no signals to Erfurt, the input on Drezno will pass through the chain and come out of Drezno unchanged. In this example, a sine wave LFO is patched to the input of the setup, and the output to a filter and oscilloscope. But now the shape can be mangled. For example, by in or decreasing the clock on Erfurt, manually or by sending a slow square wave to the clock input, or, of course, manually selecting other values on Lipsk. The same concept can be applied to audio signals as well. In this case, an oscillator is sent into the chain via Drezno, passing through it, and then comes out as a modified wave going to a filter with a bit of modulation from an LFO. A clock to Erfurt will make rhythmical wave shape changes. And to add more depth to shapes, you can patch gates from Erfurt to Lipsk again. Even though in this setup audio rate signals are passing through the chain with Erfurt in it, gate patterns on Erfurt are still generated with the speed of the clock. So again, you can use those to trigger percussion or other things in your patches as well. In this setup, the clock is running at a slow pace, but all Leibniz modules can run at very fast speeds, so it's often worth it to experiment with audio rate clocks or modulation. Jena is a complex module to grasp because its core concept has so many applications. In order to understand it, we'll have to look at Drezno first. In the previous video, I showed how Drezno's analog to digital converter can take something like a saw wave and translate that in real time to digital gate patterns. This digital data can be transferred and manipulated through the Leibniz system. For example, if you link the data directly to the digital to analog converter of Drezno, it will translate the digital gate patterns back to an analog voltage. In this scenario, the 8-bit patterns produced by the analog to digital converter are the exact same patterns that are used by the digital to analog converter. So the shape of the voltage coming out is the same as the voltage going in. This is where Jena can come in, as it's a powerful converter itself. The twist here is that it converts 8-bit patterns, for example this one, to other 8-bit patterns, for example this one. In fact, within Jena, all 256 values that are possible with an 8-bit pattern are remapped to other values. Not just random values, but carefully selected ones. The result of this is easy to see when you place Jena in between both converters of Drezno. In this case, the 8-bit patterns created by the analog to digital converter are remapped by Jena before used by the digital to analog converter. Now, as you can see in this example, when you feed a simple saw wave into Drezno, you can get a completely different waveform as a result. The beauty of Jena is that it has more than a single way to remap incoming data. In fact, you can use the shape control to scroll through 256 subtle remapping variations. If you do this with an audio rate signal, as I'm doing now, it can turn a steady saw wave into a full wavetable oscillator. These 256 values exist within one bank, and Jena has 15 banks, all with 256 subtle variations. Here is that effect with another bank. And here with another. And another. This concept can be applied to all sorts of things, not just the saw wave. You can also remap things like LFOs or envelopes and create complex rhythmical patterns. In the online manual, you can see the banks visualized. The first 11 are designed for audio wavetables to suit various sound synthesis. But some banks are designed for more specific purposes like CV shaping or pattern generation. I'll mention some in the chapter with patches. But let's have a look at the module first. As I mentioned, Jena shines when used with other modules. This is because the only way 8-bit data can enter the module is through a ribbon cable on the back, from another Leibniz module. There are no gate inputs and no clock or frequency inputs. You already noticed the screen though. This shows the bank that's being used here. And you can change that with the red knob. Give the knob a push and you can select one of the 256 variations within the bank, like I did before to create the wave morphing. It also has a phase control. This offsets the incoming data and changes the starting point or phase of the output data. All three settings, so the bank, shape and phase, have CV inputs here. So you can use the control voltage to select the bank or automate things like wave morphing with an LFO. The module also outputs the remapped 8-bit patterns as analog gate patterns here, again with LEDs so you can see which gates are high. This is great for pattern generation. And finally, there's a link button that sends the remapped digital data created by Jena onwards to a next module in the chain when turned on. This is the core of what Jena does, but it can do so in a few different modes to optimize different situations. These modes are based on 3 parameters. The simplest of 3 is the clock. Jena can use a very fast internal clock or the clock that it receives through the Leibniz bus via the ribbon cable on the back. This can be the clock from Drezno, for example, which is even faster. And as you've seen in the previous video, the clock on Drezno can be manipulated for all sorts of fun effects. The second parameter is a bit more complex. Here you see the animation I used earlier that shows how a perfect incoming saw wave gets remapped and out comes a different waveform. In practice though, it can be hard to get a perfect saw wave perfectly in between the minimum and maximum conversion range. Anything but a perfect saw wave could cause distorted waveforms. In order to avoid this, Jena has what it calls a synchronous mode. In this mode, Jena tracks the frequency of the incoming signal and creates a perfect internal saw wave as the source for its conversion. This is great if you want to use Jena as a clean wavetable oscillator, complex LFO, or for some pattern functions. Alternatively, there is the asynchronous mode. In this mode, Jena tracks and shapes whatever signal is coming in, so without any internal saw waves used. This is great for wave shaping, as it responds to the incoming waveform, but also to remap things like sequences and envelopes, and of course to mangle audio. The third and final parameter for the modes is a simple one again. When in synchronous mode, Jena can use either a virtual rising or falling saw wave. So back to the module. When you press and hold the red knob for a bit, you enter the mode menu. These modes should now be a piece of cake to understand. The first mode is synchronous mode, as you can see because the synchronous mode LED is lit here, and it uses an internal clock with a rising saw. The second mode is synchronous with external clock and rising saw. Synchronous internal clock falling saw, synchronous external clock falling saw, and finally asynchronous internal clock no saw as it isn't synced, and of course asynchronous external clock no saw. So Jena can be used for a lot of different purposes. Here are just a few patch examples. Here you see Jena patched between the analog to digital and digital to analog converters of Drezno, just like I showed in the explanation. An oscillator is sent to Drezno's input and Drezno's direct output is used to listen to. Jena is used in synchronous mode, so it just tracks the frequency of the incoming oscillator, not the wave. This creates perfect wavetables as you saw before. Of course, there are lots of ways you can get nice results out of wavetables. Here is just an example of a more complete patch. The output of Drezno is sent to a filter modulated with an envelope. A sequencer is tuning the oscillator and triggering the envelope. This creates a fairly basic voice. An attenuated LFO is used to modulate the shape input of Jena, automating the wave morphing. Here is a variation to that setup. Instead of an LFO modulating the shape, a copy of the triggered envelope through an attenuator is used. This creates subtle character differences in the plugs. An attenuated sine wave oscillator is used to modulate the phase input, which is great for subtle or crazy FM tones. When you use Jena in asynchronous mode, it will remap the signal coming in and not just extract its frequency. This allows for other options to create wave shaping. For example, by modulating the wave shape of the input oscillator, as well as the shape on Jena. This mode easily leads to more distorted and noisy results, but it's also fun to exploit that side of Jena. Here, a joystick producing a sample and hold signal at various speeds is used to glitch through different banks. You can run any signal through Jena. Here, an LFO is used as the input of the chain, and the remapped signal is used to modulate a filter with a steady oscillator running through it. Now, the many banks and shapes of Jena offer a huge amount of LFO shapes you can scroll through. Or they can be morphed with a bit of modulation, of course. With slow LFO speeds, this effectively creates looping organic sequences. Jena is used in synchronous mode again to create perfect shapes. Special banks can be used for all sorts of things, but are designed with more specific functions in mind. For example, bank C has more core shapes. This is great for CV shaping. Here I made a simple voice controlled with a keyboard, and the envelope is sent through Drezno and Jena. Here is the basic envelope. But now other shapes on Jena will result in morphed envelopes. Bank D is another special bank. This holds so-called Walsh functions. These are sets of 8 interesting square-like patterns that create interesting waveforms when all 8 are mixed together. Here you see and hear the output of Drezno. The first 8 square waves mixed together make a sine wave. But there are many other shapes in this bank. I also connected 4 individual outputs of square patterns from Jena to a mixer off screen. These can be used for additive synthesis. Jena is also a massive source of patterns. Bank E is especially designed for pattern generation. You can find all variations in the online manual chart. In the next patch, 4 percussive elements are connected to bit outputs. Jena is used in synchronous mode and a steady clock is sent to the analog to digital input of Drezno to set the frequency. Now, each of the 256 variations equals a unique pattern. Of course, you can feed Jena other sources as well, such as a steady count from Erfurt. A clock to increase the counter on Erfurt creates clock divisions as you saw at the beginning of this video. But Jena remaps this data into new patterns. In this case, you don't need to use special bank E. Every bank and all 256 options within those will create alternate patterns. You can limit the pattern to a steady length by sending a gate from Erfurt to its reset. Bit 4 will create 16-step patterns. In the demo, I use bit 3, which creates an 8-step pattern. I'd love to hear what your favorite patches with the Leibniz subsystem are, so let me know about them in the comments. If you'd like to learn more, have a look at any of these playlists. Also, smash that like, subscribe and bell button if you want to see more Modular content from me. But that's it for now. Thanks for watching and see you next time.